you're going to have to consider. But May 4th, which is Monday, is manufacturing, construction, distribution, and general offices. And then May 12th, consumer, retail, and services. Shelter in place is still in effect for those businesses that aren't open and those people that need to stay home. And what you'll note that is missing from this list, which all of us are looking for anxiously, is hair salons, nail salons. I kind of suspect, in talking to my nail tech and my hair gal, they would be in phase 2, and I certainly hope so. I've experimented with home hair dye, and I think many of us have done that or done haircuts at home. So I'm hoping that they can figure out a way to get those open in the next phase. So these protocols are what Governor DeWine covered yesterday, and there are 4 really nice documents on the ohio.gov website for you as the employer. And the responsible protocols he did show yesterday in the press conference, and he has 5 protocols for all businesses. And the theme of this was no mask, no work, no service, no exceptions. So although it's been, hey, if you want to wear a mask, wear a mask, now the state will require a mask or a face covering, that could be a scarf, for employees and clients or customers at all times. And I'll touch on this later, but you as the employer have to provide face masks to your associates. Now that they're required, you're going to have to provide those. I know personally our team's on the phone and they don't know this yet, but I have a friend who sews them and I went and picked them up for us last night. So you've got lots of resources to find those, but you will need to start looking for these items. You're also going to need to conduct a daily health assessment. And, you know, is that an employee self-evaluation to determine if someone is fit for duty? We'll talk more about that later as we go over a reopening plan and how you want to conduct those. Maintaining good hygiene, we have seen this over and over and over. Social distancing, hand washing, hand sanitizer. You're going to struggle finding hand sanitizer, but it is going to be one of the things that is required in addition to cleaning and sanitizing your workplace throughout the day and at the close of business or between shifts. And the other piece to the governor's plan is to limit capacity in your building to 50% of the fire code. So that will ensure social distancing, and you want to use an appointment setting where possible. Next slide, Joe. Oh, and next slide. Sorry, I went way ahead of you, Joe. All right, so for our risk assessment, I will tell you there is a very good document we're going to send out, and I will thank a client for sending it to me. It's by the Lear Corporation, and it is called the Lear Safe Play Workbook. This is an interactive workbook that will give you all the signage, all the documents, all of the information you need to really reopen your business. And it's interactive. You can jump back and forth to the pieces and parts you need. But one of the first things that you want to think about if and when you reopen your business is we need to do a risk assessment. And the first thing you have to do is you need to check your state and local guidelines. We have the state guidelines for Ohio. If you have locations in other states, you need to comply with what they're doing in that state. You want to conduct your due diligence. Every business is different and their needs will be different. For example, we're reopening officially next Monday with staggered staff. So I think about half of us are coming in, and that assures social distancing. We are putting hand sanitizer out as you come in the door, at the copier, in the lunchroom, outside the restrooms. We're also locking our doors to visitors. The FedEx guy and UPS guys we will let in. We will be placing signage on our front door, our lunchroom, to remind people to hand wash, as well as in the restrooms. And I think we're going to put the markers on the floor for 6-foot social distancing. Now for us, most of our staff have individual offices, so social distancing isn't such a big deal for us. We do have some cubes, and in the cubes, only one person is going to be working. The other three are going to stay home and work remotely. So that works out well for us. But that may not work for you, and you may have to reconfigure your office floor plan. This is all going to be dependent on how you manage that 6-foot distance. You also want to probably appoint a COVID-19 officer or a multidisciplinary team responsible for your health and safety guidelines. And if you are a manufacturing plant or you already have a safety officer, you want to include them as well as HR. And I'm going to talk a lot about HR today because HR is going to play a very significant role in the reopening of your business. And the last thing you want to do is conduct your risk assessment. You want to review the guidelines from the CDC, OSHA, and again, your local government. Identify hazards in your business, assess your risks. What is your risk exposure? What are your isolation protocols? What if employee tests positive? How do you handle that? And you have to be prepared to deal with ongoing work from home issues as well as OSHA issues. OSHA complaints are up significantly, by the way, due to workplace safety complaints. You want to think about your PPP loan. Did you receive it? How do you staff with that? Are you going into the second round and trying to apply as of yesterday? You want to control those risks, do risk avoidance, transfer, and of course, monitor your results. Next slide, Joe. So this is an interesting slide. And I know in our office, as I just said, we have locked the doors. I'm actually in the office this week. We have locked the doors to visitors. We are not allowing customers on site. If you are a business, though, that you have to do that, and there may be situations where you have to allow visitors in or you have customers that have to come on site. You want to think about safety. How do you consider these visitors? Do you have special hours for them? You need to protect those vulnerable associates. And we'll talk more about high-risk associates soon. You want to clearly post your operating hours and instructions for those visitors or customers to do business with you. Do as little face-to-face contact as possible. We have been conducting renewal meetings via GoToMeeting or Teams. We can fairly, in our business, function everything we need via phone or Skype. So you want to figure out how do you do that with as little interaction that's face-to-face as possible. You want to also determine, post, and enforce your maximum occupancy in your building. Also consider providing hand sanitizer, if you can find it, and 6-foot markings on the floor. Next slide, Joe. So who do you call back? And we're going to talk about some of these pieces before I go into, gosh, how do we open? And these are all things you need to be thinking about before you open your business. And we'll talk about a communication plan, and this is where HR really is going to be overwhelmed. So how do you determine who you call back? And do you review and comply with your handbook? Yes, that should be your first step. Can you call back low-risk employees first? Not necessarily, because it's probably going to invite age discrimination and pregnancy discrimination for starters. But if you have someone you know is of high risk of infection, that is a reasonable factor to allow them to still work at home or not return from furlough right now. So let's say you happen to know you have an asthmatic who may be in their 30s and they're pregnant, just as an example. That's high risk. You probably do not want to consider them to come back to the office, at least if you're doing your staff return in waves of people. And remember, as Rachel Kutai said on last week's webinar, a lot of HR laws have not changed. So your EEOC rules have not changed. You still have to adhere to those practices. So can you recall by seniority? Maybe. Recall by merit? Well, that's subjective. It's better to consider using objective measures of merit, such as written performance evaluations. And I will share with you, I'm sure you've sat on as many webinars as I have, several attorneys, including Voorhees and Littler, as well as SHRM, have said the furloughs have been an opportunity for employers to RIF those low performers, which absolutely I'm sure is happening. Make sure that there is documentation to support that when you decide not to bring those people back from a furlough. If they file a complaint with the EOC, the Department of Labor, et cetera, you need to have documentation as to why they were furloughed and not brought back into the workforce. Next slide, Joe. All right, so what if you have employees that are resistant to return to work? And I believe you will have some. I don't know how many of you follow the DeWine Facebook group, but there are a lot of people that are really freaked out about this and returning to work, and they're terribly afraid of getting the virus. So the best guidance from Littler and Voorhees is reassure your employees that you're operating in a safe workplace. You're following your state and local health guidelines. You're following what Governor DeWine has said. And there's currently no recognized health or safety hazard in our workplace. That's really what you want to tell them. You want to ease those fears and assure that you as the employer have done everything you can to bring them back to a safe environment. So next slide. So what if, and this will happen, I believe, you have someone, let's go back to a high-risk health employee that has, you know, they really are resisting coming back into the office because they're high risk. What do you do about accommodations? And you really want to engage, have a conversation, make sure you put it in writing. And I thought this was interesting too. Last year, you may have been able to show that working from home was an undue hardship. Now, with the governor still really pushing for those that can work from home, allow them to do that. If you are in an office setting and your staff can work from home, and maybe that person that's high risk because of their health conditions doesn't have to be back in the office, you should allow them to continue to work from home. Again, you don't want to end up getting sued or somebody filing a complaint. Next slide. So these two are really, the next couple slides, I really think are great information. And again, I'm sure you're going to have this happen. And again, this is all to prepare you for how do we then open? We have to be prepared for all of these scenarios. So what if you offer work and your employees refuse to return? So I know on this call, I have a few employers who have people on furlough right now. So what happens if you say, we're bringing XYZ employees back on May 5th, and they refuse to come back? So a few things. You don't have to pay them if they refuse to return to work. You also don't have to let them take PTO or vacation. They, however, depending on what state you're in, may be eligible for state or local mandatory sick leave. That is not the case in Ohio, but if you have associates in other states, that may be the case. So you need to be aware of that. But they are not qualified for emergency paid sick leave if they're on furlough. So let's remember, EPSL, if they're truly furloughed and they're not on payroll, they don't come back to work, they don't get the emergency paid sick leave. And remember, there's only 6 reasons to take that regardless. The above should disqualify them from unemployment. Now, here's going to be, I think, another issue. Depending on your hourly rate for your hourly employees, manufacturing, whatever those industries might be, you may have employees that actually are making more on unemployment with the pandemic unemployment assistance of up to an additional $600 a week on top of Ohio state unemployment than they were making at their $9 or $10 an hour job. So you really want to be prepared for those employees that say, I'm not coming back because I make more on unemployment. The other thing to that is, if you want to bring them back part-time, you really want to think about whether that makes sense for your business. And it might be the only thing that does make sense financially. That employee, depending on a lot of factors and their income, they may make less coming back part-time, and they may lose their unemployment entirely. So it may benefit them again to stay at home and collect unemployment. So you need to be prepared for that scenario. Next slide. All right, so what if you offer that job to your associate and they actually accept it? Yes, I want to come back to work. I don't like to be on unemployment. I want to get back in the workplace. Remember, a lot of your HR rules have not changed. When you are bringing them back from a furlough, you are offering them their job again. You need to think about whether you conduct background checks again, drug tests, I-9 compliance, even with the relaxed rules. What about W-4 benefits and any other new hire information? Your employer may have went through a renewal by the time you bring people back, and benefits, cost, whatnot may have changed. You need to make those furloughed employees that return aware of that. And remember about waiting periods for benefits. And in Ohio, right now, remember they can return from furlough on the date that they return. Now, that may not be the case in other states. So again, for those of you that have multi-site locations, you want to make sure you're aware of all of that too. So next slide, Joe. So two more things as we talk about all of the questions you might get. So I know my associate, if they refuse to return to work, they probably aren't eligible for emergency paid sick leave. But are those that do return to work from furlough immediately eligible? Yes. Remember, there are no waiting periods for emergency paid sick leave. You could bring somebody back May 5th and May 6th, they say to you, gosh, you know what? My child's still at home because the schools are closed. I need to apply for emergency paid sick leave, rule number 5, because my child's daycare or school is closed and I cannot work at the office. I do think we will see a lot of that. That will dovetail into, well, what about FMLA Plus? And if you remember, FMLA Plus is only for one reason, only, and that is to take care of their kids because daycares and schools continue to be closed. So for our HR gurus on the call, and I know I've got a few of mine on there, you have to do some look back on the FMLA Plus. If you have a furloughed associate that comes back to work, you need to look at 29 of the Code of Federal Regulations and do the timing and look at their calendar day eligibility. They may actually be eligible for FMLA Plus based on their prior employment. All right, so again, lots of things for HR to consider, and you got to be aware of these before you open up your business. So let's look at the next slide. All right. So let's talk more about leave of absence. And I want to say, given all the new and rapidly changing legislation, before we talk about these bullet points, after we get through this pandemic, or even now, you may want to consider paying a vendor to handle your ADA, FMLA, and leave policies. This takes about 3 months to set up, but I think after we all go through this and the complexity, if we as a country have to shut back down again, or even a state, you're going to probably wish you had somebody handling this for you. But you do need to think about compliance in 2020 is going to be more challenging than it ever has. And you want to make sure you ask a lot of questions. Use your go-to resources. You should have an ERISA attorney or a benefit-specific attorney that you can call. Think HR, we offer to all of our clients. It's free. Remember, you can call or email them. They have state-by-state compliance guidelines. Call your preferred benefits account manager. We're, I think, all on the phone today. We are a fantastic resource for you, and if we don't know, we will find out. Your payroll vendor is a good resource too. So you want to make sure, reach out to your resources. There's a lot of moving parts. And next bullet, remember that states and cities, again, are passing a significant amount of new mandatory leave laws. So you really need to pay attention to where you have associates. You're going to want to devote extra resources to leave compliance, not only if you just have people in Ohio, but if you have multi-state and multi-city employer locations, you really want to pay attention to this. So again, you don't end up in a lawsuit or getting sued. So let's go to the next slide. All right, so we've talked about, oh my gosh, what all do we talk about? How do we communicate this to our associates? And I think the key takeaway here is two things. You want to communicate to your associates before you reopen your business and bring employees back. You want to also do it on the day they return to work. And I know all of this has been a lot of information, but you need to get pertinent information out to your employees. And you want to make sure that you do this in writing. Your communication plan is clear, it's concise. You also want to remember you include those furloughed employees as well as those working at home. Don't forget that they need to be in the communication loop as well so they know what to expect. We have a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear. And I think for a lot of people, just an overall depression, for lack of a better word, about all the things we aren't able to do right now. They need some stability, and work may have been that for them before. So you want to make sure that you're reassuring them of your plan. So next slide, Joe. And this slide has got a lot of information on it. I know that. So I'm going to take you through pieces and parts. So you need to communicate your company's COVID-19 response. As an overall policy, you need to make sure that it's industry specific. It includes what workers will continue to work from home and those that will be coming back into the office or the plant, and when is that? You need to acknowledge their fears surrounding their job, the company's future, and assure them of their value and the company's desire to keep them as part of the team. I think through this whole pandemic, we've seen a lot of, and the majority of employers doing the right thing. You want to make sure you continue to do the right thing by your employee, but also that fits for your business needs as well. You really need to be transparent about your management decisions. Hiding decisions or making them unclear or vague is going to heighten anxiety and fear, plus spread rumors. And we all know when that rumor mill gets going, it gets out of control. And I've talked about this one before, but really remember to remind those returning employees or those still working at home, use their employee benefits such as the Employee Assistance Program and telemedicine. Telemedicine visits are still free. Even though physician offices are opening back up Monday, I believe they will still highly encourage the use of telemedicine unless you have to go in. And they can triage you when you call to make an appointment to determine that. You know, if you need x-rays or an MRI or blood work, you have to go in. But if they can refill medications, those kind of things over the phone or via telemedicine, make sure your employees are using that. You still want to protect them, which then protects your workplace from the virus coming into your workplace. You want to communicate the future of the business often. And again, this assures your associates you have a plan and that they will continue to have a job. And this whole pandemic has been a work in progress for all of us. So as your business needs change and maybe production ramps back up, you want to continue giving employees an update. You also need to include in your communication plan, and we've heard this over and over again, and you hope your employees have been glued to the news, but maybe they're not. What are the signs and symptoms of COVID? You have to have a written policy for daily self-screening. And what if an employee gets infected or a family member gets infected? What are your isolation protocols? If you're going to take temperatures, SHRM would highly recommend you don't record them, because then you may have to report it sooner or later down the road. If you're not going to take temperatures, but you have associates do that themselves, maybe they take them before they walk in and they affirm that they have a temperature under 101, which is the magic number for COVID. And we're going to talk about a lot of policies that need updated, but if you're going to take temperatures at your place of employment before an employee walks in the building, you have to add a policy to address it. Next slide. So what do you communicate? We've got the first big slide. This one, again, we've seen it all over the news, but you need to make sure your associates are clear about the requirements for social distancing. Understand that there's 6 feet. Split your shifts. Place markers on the floor. Staggered meal and rest breaks. You want to designate your meal and rest break areas. Maybe you have to split those up. Maybe you do like some of the restaurants are doing, and every other table they can't use, or every other microwave, however that works in your lunchroom. You want to limit the number of employees permitted in any meeting room, conference room, or confined space. I said it before, but you may have to reevaluate your office floor plan, move your desks, move your workstations. Maybe like have every other cubicle, those people stay home and work from home. You also want to make sure they understand personal hygiene, frequent hand washing. Should you require them to wear masks? Well, now we know we have to. So again, you have to provide those to your associates. The Lear Safe Work Playbook I'll send out after has all of these. It has signage for every one of them, and you can literally plug and play that information into your policy and your plan. Another policy HR has to address is social distancing and cross-training employees. And I think this one's a really important one, and I'll talk about it again. If you have a key employee that's going to work from home and somebody else is in the office and they need to do some of those duties because it's an immediate need, you need to make sure people are trained. And I don't think every employer has the time, or we don't always think about it. We think, yes, we should, but we don't cross-train. And that I think through this pandemic is going to be important to make sure our folks are cross-trained. So next slide, Joe. So this is going to be, I'm sure this is going to happen. What if someone claims they were infected at work? So this is going to be a really tricky one to prove unless you are a healthcare worker or you're a first responder. For those groups of people specifically, they are in some states presumed to have gotten the virus while they're at work because they are on the front lines. If you are not a healthcare worker or a first responder, grocery worker, delivery driver, fireman, police, you need to take all these complaints seriously as the employer. They will be subject to investigation and evaluation by your Bureau of Workers' Comp carrier. It's going to be very difficult to prove that someone was actually infected at work unless they were a first responder, but the question will probably come up. Next slide. So we're going to spend a bit of time talking about this, and these 4 blocks are just a very short graphic for you. As I said earlier, our HR folks have been working a lot of hours trying to manage the questions, how do we work remotely? Now, as we're trying to reopen our workplace, you are going to have to continue to interpret and implement new laws. You have to remember about FFCRA, which encompasses, of course, your EPSL and FMLA plus the CARES Act. HR's job is not going to be any easier. One of the things I'm going to send out afterwards, Think HR, which all our clients have access to, again, has a really good return to work checklist. You can literally go down and look at everything on this list and say, have we put this in place for our business? They also have sample policies. Littler Mendelsohn also has samples of all policies. If you go to their website, they have a COVID resource center. And they are two really good resources, along with that Lear Safe Play workbook. So things that HR is going to need to be really cognizant of. Remember, workers' rights and responsibilities still exist. Again, HR laws haven't changed. You do want to review your hiring policies. Have staffing needs changed? Maybe you were on furlough because you have no work coming into your manufacturing plant. Maybe that's going to gradually ramp up. You have to review your policy and edit that if needed. You also want to review and revise your leave policies. Know how FFCRA affects your current policy. Here's another one I think is really interesting, and I would not have thought of this, but Sherm mentioned this. You may want to consider implementing a PTO, vacation rollover, or grace period. If your time is lost at the year end, it is use it or lose it. And people obviously can't travel right now. I don't know about you, but I don't want to take a vacation and sit in my house because I've already been sitting there for 6 weeks. So I can't really fly anywhere. So you may want to consider allowing unused time to roll into next year. I think that's a really good idea, but you need to revise your policy if you do that. You want to review and revise your attendance policies. This is going to, again, play into how does FFCRA affect your business? You also want to review and revise your work from home and your childcare policies. Again, FFCRA plays into this because I do believe more people are going to say, I can't return to the workforce, and that's okay because my kids are still out of school. I have to be home with them. So that's another policy you're going to need to look at. And Rachel Kutai said this last week, but it bears repeating. Remember, for those people working from home, for your non-exempt, you have to maintain timekeeping, off-the-clock work they get paid for, meal and rest breaks, and remember overtime. You cannot have them call in for a weekly webinar or a weekly team meeting if they're not getting paid because they are non-exempt. For your exempt and non-exempt employees, remember you may have expenses now that you're going to have to reimburse them for. None of us chose to work from home. They may have increased their internet speed. They may now be using a cell phone at home that maybe an hourly worker wouldn't have used as part of their daily job in the office. They may have had to buy office supplies, a printer, ink, paper. Those are things that you're going to have to reimburse them for. So your salaried folks, you probably have an expense reimbursement policy. You're going to need to update that for your non-exempt as well. One other thing that falls into this, and I found this really interesting, and this was communicated by Littler Mendelson, you need to review your dress code. And I know you're going, well, why would I do that? Well, now that your people are required to wear a mask, you want to make sure that conforms to your dress code. You don't want someone, if you are not providing masks, although you should, or if they already have one and they're going to say, hey, I've got one, you need to make sure it conforms to your dress code. It doesn't have profanity. It doesn't have vile pictures. It doesn't have any of the things that your dress code would prohibit. So that's another policy you need to look at. One other thing that you need to think about is how do you accommodate someone who may not be able to wear a mask? What if you have a deaf associate who can read lips? They need to be able to read somebody else's lips, and they may speak some. So you need to think about that. You also need to think about a disciplinary procedure for non-compliance with the governor's reopening guidelines. Again, what if someone refuses to wear a mask? What if someone habitually goes right into someone else's cubicle and they're standing right next to them and they're not 6 feet apart? You need to update your disciplinary procedures. You also need to update, potentially, your workplace travel policies. The example I think of for our business especially is non-essential travel has not been lifted yet, but how do we handle meetings with clients? We obviously aren't driving to them. We aren't flying out anywhere right now, so you may need to review that and update it. Review your rehire and reinstatement provisions for benefit plans, eligibility and waiting periods. Again, in Ohio, they will come back on all your benefits the date that they return from furlough or layoff. So if you don't already have one, and Jason Bainham in our office talked about this a couple weeks ago on our webinar, you really need to take time and develop a disaster preparedness plan. In the event it all blows to hell in a handbasket here in a couple months because we've all not been social distancing like we should, you really need to make sure you have this in place. And you want to talk about within that, implement a plan to continue essential business function. Who works in the office? Who doesn't? Who works remotely? You need to implement flexible work schedules and leave policies. Cross-training employees. Again, I can't state this enough. I think this is critical. You need to develop an emergency communication plan. How do you connect with your team? Do you do that via Teams, Zoom? How often? When and how often? Lastly, you need to distribute all of these policies to your employees and communicate them. So that was just the first 3 bullets on this slide. As we talk about your return from layoff or furlough, you aren't required to do this in writing, but remember, you are offering them their job back. So you ideally want to return them from a furlough in writing with a formal letter. And Think HR, SHRM, a lot of places have a good sample letter that you can use. That letter at a minimum should include details about the return to work. When, what location, what is their pay, when do their benefits start, and what date do they return back to work? Remember, they may have taken a new job while furloughed, and you're offering them their job back. You can't assume they will just come back. And they also may make more on unemployment and may decide not to come back. Remember, when they do come back, you need to reinstate any benefits that were terminated if they were terminated while on furlough. I know a lot of employers that I work with have at least kept their people covered through March or through April, and some even through May. But if you terminated benefits and offered COBRA, you want to make sure you reinstate those benefits when they return to work. Next slide, Jill. So that was a lot of information, and that's why we'll send out the slide deck, the recording plus the resources. I know it's a lot of information. The last thing I have is a slight legislative update, not a whole lot in the news this week regarding legislation. As you probably have heard, the president did sign the $484 billion Healthcare Enhancement Act on April 24th. This is divided into 2 parts. The first part provides additional funding for the small business protection programs, such as PPP and EIDL. It is replenishing that, and those employers that were already in the queue from the first PPP but didn't get funded, they are taking first priority starting April 27th. The new EIDL and PPP loan applications will now include agriculture industry, and they could start applying on the 27th as well. I did hear this morning from the Today Show that there's already been system issues, system glitches, there's a log jam. It is not working as anticipated. So I'm afraid some of our small businesses that are still waiting on that money may have a little bit longer to wait. The additional funding in this bill was provided for hospitals and for research and development regarding COVID-19 testing capabilities. And I do know that several states are ramping up testing dramatically, including Ohio. Next slide, Joe. So these are the resources that I will be attaching when we send out the slide deck. All of them are really good, but I'll tell you that Lear workbook, I cannot say enough good things. And I'm going to give props to Berlin Strife at Reliant Capital Solutions for giving that to us. And Lear distributed this to anybody who wants to use it. And please take advantage of it. Next slide, Joe. All right, so as we wrap up today, I know this is a lot of information. I expect we'll get questions. As with all our webinars, we want to get you as much information as possible and as quickly as we can. So we're going to reserve questions for afterwards. You can email those to info@prefben, or you can send them directly to me at wendy@prefben.com. And then later today, we will send out the email with the presentation, the recording, and the resources. And as questions come in, we'll put together an FAQ and send that out as well. So I hope everybody stays safe, has a great week, and put together your plan to reopen your business. America needs us all to be open and working. Thanks and have a great day.